also with the Southport Mosque, other mosques, Muslim communities, refugees in hotels, African, Caribbean and Asian communities, and all those subjected to violent and racist attacks during last year's riots. Our thoughts are also with the emergency services who had to respond to those horrific events and all those affected by last year's riots. We also remember the heroic response of anti-racists up and down the country who stood up, defended their communities, and said no to racist riots. Recent events in Epping, in Essex, and elsewhere show that the far right is determined in its attempt to repeat last year's horrific events. And on Sunday in Epping, anti-racists responded by bringing the spirit of last year's anti-racist mobilizations that halted the riots. Today, we've got a fantastic lineup of speakers who will be talking about what happened last year and how the far right is attempting to repeat the events this year and how we can respond as anti-racists by mobilizing, challenging, and uniting against racism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism and fascism. I'd now like to move on to our speakers, and our first speaker today, I'm very pleased to welcome somebody who has been an important campaigner against racism and fascism for decades now. Please, I'd like, please everyone, welcome Belle Ribeiro-Addy MP.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me here today, and thank you to all of you that continue to speak up and stand up and show up when it matters the most. Now, we're here to mark a very dark anniversary, 1 year since fascists who were emboldened by the dangerous rhetoric of the media and a government scapegoating the vulnerable descended on hotels, communities and people who were simply seeking safety. Now, we have to be absolutely clear, what happened last year wasn't a protest, it was organised hate, it was fascist violence, it was an attack on refugees and actually an attack on all of us who believe in basic human dignity. And we also have to be clear that it didn't come from nowhere. This violence was fed and fueled by years of political messaging that actually treats refugees not as people but as problems, by headlines that dehumanize them, and successive governments that talk about invasions and strangers and threaten deportations to Rwanda and use vulnerable people to distract from their own failings, and policies that warehouse people in really unsafe and inhumane conditions in barges and barracks and hotels and then blame them when unrest follows. And yet when the far-right mobs turn up, it's refugees who are blamed, not the people that are hurling the abuse and not the politicians or the media that are stoking the flames, but those that are most in need of protection. And we've seen this play out before, and we know how it ends if we don't stop. Now, the MPs like myself, we tend to receive a lot of racist abuse and sometimes threats. And I want to read one to you because, and I'll make the point that I want to about the end about it. No, there's this guy that calls me quite regularly and he refers to me as Ribeiro-Addy. And he says, okay, Ribeiro-Addy, or whatever your bastard foreign name is, you're a piece of shit like every politician. You're the ones who backed up this scum and stopped taking criminal migrants to a barge. You supported them. We don't want people like you or any of these people in our country. This country is going to be returned to what it once was, at least 96% plus British, pure British people, a few decent foreigners. If they live up to the right standards, the rest of you scum, and that includes people like you, Ribeiro-Addy, you're going to be removed. You're going to be strapped to the cargo holds of ships and planes and removed. And there's going to be massive violence across London today. You'll read about it on Monday and tomorrow. And that's just the beginning of the beginning. Next step is to target politicians in their stinking offices and homes, and that will happen. So remember, Rebel Belt Rowdy, you're going to get a visit very soon. Now, he sent this on the 2nd or 3rd of August, and the worst violence that occurred during the weekend, actually occurred during the riots last year, was on the 3rd or 4th of August, when far-right mobs attacked multiple hotels in Rotherham. People attacked buildings, smashing windows, setting fire to riot vans, and at least 10 officers were injured. And the second hotel in Tamworth with windows smashed and chants saying, "Get them out." Now, I make this point about this particular individual because as we look towards the summer and with the far right planning more actions, we need to understand that they are organised. If the mad person that calls my phone to leave threats on it is quite well informed about what's going to happen, then, you know, we have to understand they are organised. And with more scapegoating the press and more hostile policies in the pipeline, we have to be ready. We have to be organised ourselves, and not just by responding, but also leading. And so every time these fascists turn up, we have to turn up in bigger numbers and make clear that refugees are not outsiders, that they're part of our communities, that they're our neighbours, our classmates, NHS workers, our future, and make a point about safe legal routes and international solidarity. Because this isn't about just defending refugees, it's about defending who we are and the kind of country that we want to be. So I want to thank every single one of you that continues to come out, particularly those that came out last year when, for those of us who it felt like it was being targeted towards, we felt like people were, you know, spouting all this racist abuse, talking not just about migrants, but you know, the descendants of migrants, and making those key points. But when people show up in their numbers, it really does show a sense of solidarity. So we need to make sure that we continue to do that, because the far right really want us to feel small and scattered and afraid. But when we come together and when we, you know, link arms across race and faith and background, they can absolutely not win. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Belle. That's a fantastic contribution. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'd now like to move on to our next speaker, who is here representing the National Education Union, a union which has been proud to stand up to racism and fascism for decades now. We are very pleased to be joined by the General Secretary, Daniel Kebede.
Thanks very much, Sabby. And look, I just want to say a few things. Thank you for organising this event. It's incredibly important. Look, I was watching Channel 4 News last night, and there was quite a long feature a year on from the riots, and they were interviewing victims of the riots, a family in which the mother had come to this country to work as a carer, had children here, and, you know, quite frankly, her children were still terrified. The riots and the fear of those riots still live on in communities. It's absolutely an issue for educators to take up, fighting racism and fighting the far right, for trade union members, not just in my union, but in the defence of all workers. Children today are still terrified from those riots last year. But I also do want to say a big thank you to every NEU member and everyone who turned out in Epping at the weekend, because we outnumbered them. There were trade union banners there, and it was a turning point against what has been going on with the protests outside the asylum seeker hotels. And we need to see much more of that every time the far right turn out against them. But look, Nigel Farage and Reform and Lee Anderson, they have been encouraging these protests, but where are they getting the confidence from? It has been from our Prime Minister, tail-ending anti-migrant, anti-refugee rhetoric that has been tail-ending the rhetoric from Reform that has given the confidence. We aren't an island of strangers. We are an island of friends, of colleagues, and of classmates. But we can't stop with what we saw at the weekend. The big mobilizations after the riots last year pushed things back. This weekend was a turning point, but we are going to have to keep coming out in defense of our communities. So every time they try to target refugees, we absolutely have to be there. And I do just want to put out a call out actually for a big mobilization on the 13th of September. Tommy Robinson is allegedly on the run at the moment, but he will be pulling a very big crowd into central London on the 13th of September. And look, I remember last year, prior to the riots, when we were outnumbered by Tommy Robinson's mob in Trafalgar Square. And I think actually if we'd outnumbered them at that demonstration, the riots wouldn't have happened. So do make sure it is a big mobilisation, but let's make sure that we are absolutely building this in our workplaces and our communities, because at the end of the day, racism is used by the powerful to divide black and white, to keep everybody down. When they were interviewing the other people, the wider community of Middlesbrough in the news item last night, the number one complaint was the lack of housing. It's not down to refugees that there's a lack of housing. It's because we live under an economic system that extracts wealth from our communities to line the pockets of the wealthy. The far right, the fascist, that homeland that were central to the Epping mobilisations, they do not have a vision for society in which all children can flourish. We do, but to do that, we have to defeat racism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for that fantastic contribution, and thank you to the NEU for all its support. I'd now like to move on to our next speaker. I'm very pleased to welcome the other co-convener of Stand Up to Racism, that is Weyman Bennett.
I want to thank everybody who's joined us today and thank all the speakers. But I'm going to tell you the story of Epping in this way, in terms of week is a long time in politics, they say. But last Thursday, I stood in Epping as a group of people, and I'd say they were mainly led by fascists. Let's not be lighter and say they were led by other people who pelted us with stones, who threw loads of things at us, and attempted to do much more than that. They attempted to carry out they were rioting. They beat up the police, they smashed up police vans, and they behaved in a way that was completely unacceptable. And the truth of it is that the reason why they were also encouraged to do that was because of Nigel Farage. Nigel Farage has not done this once, he's done this twice. After Southport, he said, there are questions that have not been answered in which we've been lied to. He deliberately incited these levels of attacks. And, you know, I watched young Asian and black kids running who lived in Epping, running on the street in the same way as I did as a child, away from people who were simply just walking down the street being chased by these people. And this is not a demonstration, that's terrorism. That's terrifying people. That's what it's aimed at. And so when people have got up and said that there may be reasons why people are doing that, there are reasons. Firstly, the other lie that was told was that we were bussed in and we were given £1.6 million from the government. Now, I'm not going to lie. We would welcome that £1.6 million, but of course, it's a total and utter lie. We didn't get that. The people that fly in private jets and arrive inside yachts, they're the people that spread those lies. Nigel Farage spreads those lies, and he does it deliberately because he wants to win votes. He wants to attack Muslims. He wants to push forward an anti-Semitic theory of the great replacement theory, that people are being replaced by people from outside. I spoke to a refugee from a war-torn country who says he's been terrified twice. Once in the middle of a war, and the second time looking out of his window inside the hotel where he's supposed to be safe. And we have to say that refugees are welcome here. Refugees are not the source of the reason why people are in poverty or why they've lost jobs. And you don't have to go very far. Listen to the Border Force people who describe the people they rescue from the sea every day and how traumatized they are and how glad that they do their job. And they're right at the front line of it. And they say they support refugees. And we should celebrate that, the people that do that. The second thing I want to say, if you want to meet a refugee or migrant, hop down to your local hospital, because that's where they'll be. They'll be there saving your life. And one of the reasons why I'm here is because my mother told me that when she was in the middle of a riot, my family lived in Notting Hill in the 50s, that when the black shirts tried to do exactly the same thing that they did today, that people came out and resisted them, and people had to resist. And we shouldn't forget, these people are linked to all the far right across Europe, the AfD, and I also want to say this about Trump. If you want to find somebody who's living in a flash hotel, who's actually got a conviction for sexual assault, right? Who's Epstein's best friend and Ghislaine Maxwell's best friend for a long period that needs to be investigated, you don't have to go very far. You can go to that billionaire's golf course, and we shouldn't be rolling out the red carpet for such a man, actually, who's got those kind of, if you were serious about it, that's what you would do. So we know they don't care about women. We know this because of the amount of domestic violence carried out by the far right and their supporters. They don't care about women and they don't care about children. The people that care about children are the people that teach them or educate them every day in those areas and make sure that they're kept safe. And they turn around and say that those people should be given the support. We say justice for the victims, but don't let the racists and the fascists divide us. But I do want to say something very quickly about why, if you resist, it changes. I was so glad to be on the demonstration on Sunday. I thought I was in a different place, a different planet. And it was there because the solidarity of trade unions, local people coming out and saying, we won't put up with this. We will not put up with division and hate. It is true that people try and peddle it and they tell us lies that they're the majority. But as Malcolm X said, you're never outnumbered, you're sometimes out-organized. And it's important that we organise on the 13th of September to make sure that Tommy Robinson, who will try and build off every attack that takes place, doesn't gain any kind of confidence at all about that. And I never forget the spirit of Walthamstow. I remember before Walthamstow, I'm not going to lie to people on this call, I wasn't exactly confident that it's going to be automatically all right, yeah? I wasn't going to tell you you're going to be safe. And each hour, the Nazis are ringing up saying, I'm coming to get you. This will be the last demonstration you're on, Weyman, Bennett. Make sure you enjoy your time. But we turned up on that demonstration. And guess what? None of them turned up. In fact, one of them turned up. And I whispered to one of the stewards to go and whisper in his ear, it's best that you leave the space because it's not safe for fascists or racists to be in a space which is dominated by the majority of us. So I think we have to really celebrate that we have communities that can resist. We have people that are trans, we have women, we have LGBT, we have young and old, we have Jewish communities, we have Muslim communities, we have black communities that have years and years of question of building resistance. We have the trade unions that can make all the difference in terms of the power they have in order to make sure that everybody stands back and resist them. But also, we've got political leadership that's on this call. People like Diane Abbott, people like Fran, we've got people like Sarah, we've got people like Bell, we've got all these people that actually we've got Mohammed Kozbar, we've got Chantelle, we've got so many people that could play a role and do play a role in resistance. And so I think that if we stand up against racism together, the most important lesson that we have to learn is that we've beaten back the bullies 4 times. Remember the British National Party? They said that they were going to rule this country. We put them in the bin of history. Remember the EDL? We don't know where Tommy is at the moment, but the organisation we put in the bin of history by mobilising against them and putting them into the bin of history. The Football Lads Alliance. And even last year, when even those dark days of pogroms seemed to be lurking, we stood back against them and organised against them. The lesson we have is that we have to fight back against those people that seek to divide us and never, never, never give an inch. And I'll end up on this. We owe it to the other generations. I owe it to the Jewish people that lived in East London who told me about the Holocaust and warned me about the Holocaust and what it meant and why you have to stand up against these people every single time. To the people that fought from the Windrush generation, the Muslim communities, all have fought back and said that we have to stand together in unity with black, white, and stood back and fought them back. That's our tradition. It's a tradition from Cable Street to the present day. We have to keep that tradition and keep that going with Stand Up to Racism and all the work that are people going. And my final thank you is to all those people out there that stood outside those hotels. Please come and stand outside the hotel in Islington and keep standing up. Because if we stand together, our voices can be heard and our resistance makes all the difference for standing up to those people that try and bully us and tell us that we shouldn't support those people in most need. So thank you very much, and I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Weyman. So I think Weyman's reminded us that sadly, things have moved in a negative direction over the last year, with polls now showing that Reform UK could be the largest party at the next general election. And also last week, we saw Nigel Farage and Reform UK winding up tensions and encouraging those on the far right, encouraging protests against the Bell Hotel, which is accommodating asylum seekers. Shame on them, because those protests in Epping were organised by Homeland, which is a fascist organisation. And well done to everyone who has stood up in Epping and elsewhere to these awful demonstrations, which have often turned violent up and down the country. So well done to those standing up against that. I'd now like to welcome our next speaker. So we're really proud to have the support of the trade union movement, and PCS has been an outstanding trade union in its commitment to fighting racism and also defending refugees and asylum seekers. You played a heroic role in campaigning against the racist rhetoric around stopping the boats and actually defending Home Office workers who are facing a difficult situation in implementing these horrific policies. So well done, and thank you to the PCS, and welcome to the General Secretary of PCS, Fran Heathcote.
Thanks so much, Sabby, and thank you everybody for having me along tonight. And as others have done, I want to start by remembering the victims of the horrific murders in Southport a year ago. 3 little girls going to a dance class were murdered, 10 people were injured, and dozens will be traumatised to this day by what they witnessed on that fateful day. The perpetrator of those terrible crimes is now behind bars, but a whole community in Southport and many others across England were also traumatised because of a deceitful and divisive far right who lied about the circumstances in order to whip up hatred against minorities. They said that the murderer was an asylum seeker who crossed the channel in a small boat. That was a lie. He was in fact born in Britain and known by the authorities to pose a risk. They said the murderer was a Muslim, and that too was a lie. And so we had attacks on mosques, attempts to burn down asylum hotels, neither of which would be justified even if the perpetrator had been an asylum seeker or a Muslim. Communities across England have been terrorised, families attacked in their homes and on the streets. Far-right racists dividing working class communities, and it succeeded in towns and cities across the country last summer, which is why what we're doing tonight is so important. It's a wake-up call to all of us, isn't it? And especially those of us within the trade union movement. The slogans and the banners of our movement tell of harder learned truths that still hold true today. Unity is strength. United we stand, divided we fall. An injury to one is an injury to all. At the festivals I've been at, the Durham Miners Gala and then Tolpuddle, you see those banners in droves. But we will only succeed in winning for working class people if we unite working class people, whether they're white, black, brown, whether they're born here or migrant, young or old, male and female, gay, straight, bi or trans. Trade unions unite people to win. The ruling class, the billionaires, the corporations, the landlords and the media barons, they want us to be divided, squabbling amongst ourselves, distracted from the reality that is underpaying us, overcharging us on our bills, our rent and our mortgages. So taking on the far right is about tackling racism, but it's also about removing a barrier to winning for working class people. Because scapegoating migrants won't get you better pay, it doesn't bring down National Health Service waiting list, and it won't reduce your rent or get you a decent home. It just gives people someone to blame. And when people feel hopeless, when they feel that politicians aren't delivering for them, then for some people that is enough, and that is what triggers a lot of this. So the rise of the far right is also a sign of political failure, a decades-long failure that has driven down wages, seen NHS waiting lists rise to record levels, led to record numbers of children growing up in poverty and record numbers of families living in temporary accommodation without a home that they can call their own. So when these politicians in Westminster pander to the far right, it just reinforces their scapegoating of migrants and the whipping up of those divisions. Why solve Britain's complex problems when you can simply point the finger? So I am really proud that my union PCS has a proud history of standing up to this xenophobic policy that does nothing for working class people in Britain. When the Tory government tried to introduce its Rwanda scheme, we took them to court and we won and we blocked that policy. But the beauty of that campaign is it came from the members themselves. It came from the people doing the job of dealing in the Home Office who said that we aren't prepared to put up with this. And when Keir Starmer makes a speech calling us an island of strangers, we condemned him too. When Rishi Sunak said stop the boats and Keir Starmer says smash the gangs, we say open safe and secure routes. There is no need for a single refugee to be forced across the channel on a small boat. About 80 people died last year, including a dozen children, making that perilous journey. And why was that? It was because governments refused to open safe routes for people fleeing war and persecution, like we rightly did for those fleeing Ukraine after the Russian invasion. Not a single Ukrainian had to cross the channel by small boat, and we could do that for asylum seekers. And if we did that, we could help so much with this whole situation. So PCS is proud to mobilise against the far right on the streets, in the workplace, and to take governments enacting far right policies to court, and to campaign for fair and equitable policies like safe routes. And we will continue to do that. We have relaunched our safe routes policy. We're desperately seeking a meeting with Yvette Cooper to pursue that work and to articulate an alternative, not just to what we don't want to see, but what would be a good alternative to make things better in this country. So our job is to unite people and to stand up to racism. So we are really proud to support Stand Up to Racism in the work that they're doing, and we will be with all of you every step of the way. See you on the streets, see you in this campaign. Solidarity. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Fran, for that fantastic contribution. And thank you again for everything that PCS is doing. I think Fran made an excellent point that asylum seekers and migrants are not to blame for austerity policies implemented by governments. And sadly, those policies are being continued by the Labour government, as is the concessions to racism on immigration and Islamophobia. It's very disappointing to see. And this meeting is obviously taking up that speech by Keir Starmer, where he referred to Britain being an island of strangers, echoing that dreadful Rivers of Blood speech by Enoch Powell. So we want a Labour government to stand up to racism and to challenge racism and the anti-migration and anti-asylum seeker rhetoric by the likes of Reform UK and the Tories, not to concede to that. So I'd now like to welcome our next speaker, who is here to talk about the Islamophobia and the hatred that Muslim communities have experienced for decades now. We're very pleased to welcome a representative from the Finsbury Park Mosque and someone who has been a fantastic activist and campaigner and supporter of Stand Up to Racism. We're very pleased to welcome Mohammed Kozbar.
Thank you very much, Sabby. Good afternoon, everyone. The horrific scene we all witnessed last year, still in our mind, at least in the mind of many people across the country. I remember when this happened last year, many people from the Muslim community, many members of our community, feared for their life, for their children's life. They've been attacked in public places. They've been attacked in their houses, in cities, different cities in the UK, from across the country, from Scotland to Northern Ireland to Manchester to Birmingham to London to Cardiff, for a crime, heinous crime, a tragedy which they have nothing to do with. All this built on a lie that a Muslim or a refugee or whatever are behind this heinous attack. And we've seen the result. We've seen how the far right tried to inflame hatred, fear, violence on a lie. And unfortunately, many people, well, basically they believed them and they went to the street, and we've seen the worst of the far right last year. And people still fear for their life this year when they hear that this might be repeated again in the country. And that's make us really feel that there is a big responsibility upon our shoulders as stand up to racism, as organizations who oppose racism, fascism, who oppose injustice. And therefore, I think I agree with everyone before me when they spoke about organizing and unity among our movement. And I think what we need to do, we need to probably to strengthen our movement, because I'm sure, and I'm sure you are as well aware about how the far right organize themselves, how they are not just only a bunch of people doing things which they don't know what they are doing about it. They are organized. They are trying to not just only organize in the UK, but even outside the UK, in the European countries. And we've seen that. We've seen some experience in different European countries where far rights are as well causing problems and violence and fear among their communities and so on. So this is why it's very important for us as movement to work not just only locally or nationally, but even globally, organizing ourselves, bringing more alliance to our movement, to think strategically and for the long term, not just only reactive or reacting about what's going on, but let's be proactive as well and prepare ourselves for the worst, to be honest, because I'm sure we all agree that probably what we've seen is not the worst. It might be even much worse in the coming weeks or month or in the future. We've seen the hatred being spread. Tommy Robinson, just only a few weeks ago, the last few days and few weeks, he made a video from Didsbury Mosque in Manchester, inflaming hatred and violence against the Muslim community. And we've seen him as well in refugee hotels in Manchester, and now his videos about what's next week in Islington. That's all show us that these people will try whatever they can, and unfortunately no one from the government, no one from the authorities challenge them and prevent them from doing that, spreading this hatred and fear. Not just only Robinson, but Farage and GP News and others. They've been giving the freedom to do that actually freely, without challenging them from the government and from the authorities. And I remember, how dare they allow them to go to demonstrate outside the places of worship like mosques? And we remember when the Palestine March tried to march, actually it is a peaceful march, marching next to a synagogue. They've been prevented from doing that. Why these people not being prevented from doing the same things, marching in places of worship and causing violence and problems for different communities? Therefore, I think it's very important. Like everyone, I call upon ourselves to organize ourselves, to try to, building this movement, this alliance with the different community, with the grassroots organizations, representatives, to make sure that we are not just only few. We are the many. We are the majority. And we've seen in Epping, we've experienced in Epping what happened to them. And I hope that in next week in Islington, that's the same things happened, and it will be bigger and bigger. Mobilizing, but not just only within the stand up to racism, but beyond that, within the Muslim community, the Jewish community, and other minorities from different communities. So let's keep the momentum. Let's keep the pressure. Let's keep the let me say the optimism. I'm really, despite all this, dark, let me say, dark situation we live in at the moment, I'm still optimistic that the majority of this country, the majority of the people are against racism, are against fascism, are against the far rights, and they want someone to lead them, and we are the movement, and we should lead on that and make sure that everyone work with us on this and try to defeat the far rights, whether it is in London, whether it is in Manchester, whether it is in Scotland, in Cardiff, everywhere. And we have to do that as soon as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mohammed, for that really powerful speech. We're very pleased to have you here this evening. And I think you made an excellent point about the solidarity that's required between Muslim, Jewish, African, Caribbean, Asian, refugees, and all communities oppressed by racism, the unity that's needed. You also made another very good point about how the anti-racists are the majority in this country. I agree with you. I am still confident and positive that we are the majority, and it's our job to harness that majority and make sure that that majority makes its voice heard when racists and fascists try to wreak havoc on our communities, whether it's on the streets or whether it's at the ballot box. So thank you again, Mohammed.
And one more point, Sabby, one more point, if you allow me, that this problem is not a certain community problem. It's everybody's problem. And now the attack on the Muslim community tomorrow is the attack on another minority and another community. So this is why it's very important to understand that now it is the Muslim community. We don't know, God knows who will be next in the future. So it's not a problem for a certain community, the Muslim community, or any other minority. It's a problem for all of us, which we should deal with it. Just only I forgot this point to mention it as well.
No, that's quite right. That's absolutely correct. An attack on one community, when one community is subjected to racism, it impacts all communities. It really does. So that's why it's important for us to stand up to all forms of racism and all communities to stand in solidarity. But as you also said quite rightly, racism is a problem for the whole of society, not just those subjected to it. So it's important for everyone to stand up to racism and challenge it wherever we see it, whether it's the Labour government or Reform UK, the Tories or fascists on our streets. We've got to challenge this and stop this race to the bottom and this campaign on who can out-tough one another on stop the boats or Islamophobia. Enough of this. We need to stand up to this racism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and all forms of racism. So moving on, we're very proud to have the support of the trade union movement. And next is an officer of Stand Up to Racism, in fact. She's also the General Secretary of the Bakers, Food and Allied Workers Union. It's a small but very powerful and very active and fantastic anti-racist union. So we're very pleased to have with us today the General Secretary, Sarah Woolley. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thanks so much, Sabby, for that introduction and for the invitation to speak tonight at what is a really, really important meeting. As the General Secretary of the Bakers, Food and Allied Workers Union, I just want to start by expressing our continued thoughts to the families directly involved in the devastating situation in Southport last year, our solidarity with everyone affected by the racist and Islamophobic riots that occurred, and our deepest respect for those that stood up in defence of their communities. to push back against those riots. What happened 1 year ago was horrific. We saw communities under attack, homes and places of worship targeted, fuelled by far-right lies, whipped up by social media and enabled by politicians and media outlets who refuse to take racism seriously when it doesn't suit their agenda. But what stood out just as powerfully was the response, because it wasn't the state or the police who protected people. It was neighbours, it was trade unionists, it was young people, elders, faith groups, people organising, communicating, standing together to defend their communities from hatred. And that's something that we can't forget and we must keep in mind, because we're not an island of strangers. We are a working class movement built on solidarity, and I am incredibly proud of the diversity of our union that represents members from all backgrounds, from countries from all around the world, all faiths and none, on the factory floor, in the bakery, on the production line. What brings us together is not fear or division, but shared struggle, shared interests and shared values. And those values, we know, are being tested now more than ever. Over the past year, we've seen an alarming rise in Islamophobic hate, anti-Semitic attacks and violent racism. We've seen far-right organisations trying to rebrand themselves and gain a foothold by feeding on fear and misinformation. And you can see it playing out online, whether it's scapegoating refugees, stoking tensions after horrific crimes, or trying to just pit working class communities against one another. Their aim is always the same: to divide us and to weaken us. But we have a different answer. It's the answer that our movement has always had: unity, organisation and action. It's trade unions organising side by side with anti-racist and anti-fascist campaigns. It's challenging racism wherever it happens, whether that's on the streets, in our workplaces, in our movement, in our media, in our institutions. It's calling out not just the far right, but the mainstream politicians who echo their language when it's convenient, and examples have been given this evening already. Because they then act surprised, don't they, when that turns to violence. But it's also about making the case that the real causes of people's hardships, low pay, insecure work, rising rents, collapsing services, won't be solved by blaming migrants or Muslims or from rioting on the streets. They'll only be solved by collective action rooted in solidarity to lift everybody up. And that's why it's so vital that we continue to mobilise, because we've seen, and we've seen it over the last few weeks, just how quickly far-right narratives can escalate when they're left unchallenged. But we've also seen that when communities are organised, when trade unions are part of that fight, we can stop them in their tracks, just as we saw in Epping over the weekend. So 1 year on, we've got to honour those who stood firm, not just in words, but in action. We've got to commit to building that unity every day, in our unions, on our streets, and in our politics. We can't just say no to racism when the headlines are bad. We have to say it every single day in everything that we do, because we know when we fight together, we win together. And fight back we must right now, especially, as Daniel and others have said, on the 13th of September, because we need to be there in mass numbers. Thanks, Sabby, for putting this on tonight, and I look forward to hearing the other speakers.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for that fantastic speech. I think you're quite right. We absolutely have to be out on the streets on the 13th of September when Tommy Robinson is pledging to mobilise in unprecedented number in central London. So we've got to make sure that we stand up to racism and fascism and stop the likes of Tommy Robinson, who are trying to build a national street movement that peddles hatred, violence, division and hostility. So thank you to all the trade unions who have already pledged support for us and who will be mobilising on the 13th of September. So all of you here joining us on this call tonight, please, after this meeting, go back to your communities and workplaces and build the 13th of September demonstration. So thank you again to Sarah and the Bakers Food and Allied Workers Union. Now, moving on, firefighters had the terrible experience last year of responding to emergency calls regarding arson attacks on hotels housing asylum seekers. We're proud to have the support of the Fire Brigades Union, and thank you to the General Secretary of the FBU, who is our next speaker. So very pleased to welcome Steve Wright.
Good evening all, and thanks, Sabby. And look, I think there's no denying that we're living in dangerous times right now, aren't we? And not just across the world under Donald Trump, the AfD in Germany, and across Europe. We've got far-right governments in place. But look, we've got that own threat right in front of us in the UK. And I think part of that threat comes from Reform UK, as Sabby mentioned, and Nigel Farage and GB News, that are all pushing racism, anti-migrant politics, division and scapegoating, as the other General Secretaries have talked about. But look, what they're doing is they're pretending that they speak for working class people, but they don't. That we know what Trump is. We know he's a billionaire. We know what Farage is. We know what Richard Tice is. And that they're not anti-establishment, that they are the establishment. And I think we need to understand that, what their politics actually stand for, that they want to scrap inheritance taxes, cut taxes for corporations, private schools looked after, privatising the NHS, attacking trade unions, that are voting every opportunity they have to ban zero-hour contracts, ban and support fire and rehire. Look, I think people need to understand that, and I think we need to expose what Reform and Nigel Farage stand for. Because look, we know where this leads. It leads to racism and it leads to fascism on the streets. And you're quite right to point out that firefighters have been on the front line of that. But as FBU members, we're also on the front line of that. Because look, we see the destruction that this has caused. So firefighters attending these incidents at hotels where fires are being set. We're part of these communities. There are communities, and we need to own up and show up every time that they show their faces. That when I become General Secretary 6.5 months ago, I talked about that being a huge honour for me, and not just about fighting for better pay and terms and conditions for our members, but actually fighting the far right, fighting this misogynistic, anti-worker rhetoric that exists in our workplaces. So that's why at our conference 2 months ago, we passed a resolution from the Executive Council to educate our members, to build literature in our workplaces, because that is the front line of what we face right now. The front line of what we face in this country is in our workplaces and in our communities. And every union rep, every shop steward has got a job to play to try and fix that. And then that transcends into what we face on the streets. So at Epping this week, an Executive Council member of ours, Jamie Newell, was on the front line. He took members with him. He took firefighters with him to oppose what they were saying and what they were doing. And I think Daniel said it, that we need to show up in greater numbers than what they do. I was at that first demonstration in Trafalgar Square where they did outnumber us. I think that did empower them. We need to make sure where they show up. So when this call comes out from Stand Up to Racism, which we fully back and fully support as a union, that we'll be there. But when they show up in smaller towns, in villages, in cities, because they will, because they're well funded, they're well organised, they've got the backing of many, many people within our society and across the world, actually. And we need to make sure that we're showing up and standing up. So trade unions, as people have said, we've got a massive part to play in this. We are the organised workers in this country. We need to make sure that we're mobilising the 6.2 million people that are union members. And we need to make sure that our paraphernalia, our rhetoric in our workplaces is that of hope and not hate. So look, we'll bring solidarity to those protests. We'll bring solidarity wherever it needs to be, but we'll bring our numbers and we'll make sure firefighters are on the front line of this. So look, I'll repeat the call to mobilise. I'll repeat the call that our union backs this movement, the movement of solidarity and the movement of hope and unity. And look, we'll be there at every opportunity we can and mobilise with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve, for that fantastic contribution. And yeah, thank you and another shout out to Jamie Newell for joining us in Epping and standing with us along with other FBU members in Epping in Essex on Sunday. We're really proud to have you with us. I think Steve also made excellent points about, firstly, the rise of racism internationally, from Trump to Meloni and Le Pen in Europe. This is an international issue. We're seeing the rise of the far right and racism internationally. This is an international movement, and we've got to stand up to that. I think Steve also made another really important point about how Farage and Reform UK try to present themselves as spokespersons for the working class. They are no friend of the working class. They are the enemy of the working class. They vote against policies and legislation like the Employment Rights Bill. And also, the working class is a diverse class. It includes African, Asian, Caribbean, refugees, Muslims, Jews, and other communities oppressed by racism. So the working class is not represented by the likes of Reform UK and Racists. It is a diverse community that needs a diverse and representative leadership. So thank you again to Steve for joining us, and thanks again to the FBU. Now, our next speaker, sadly, has had a lot of first-hand experience herself of racism, but also in Liverpool and in Knowsley, where we saw not only a repeat of attacks on mosques and riots in Liverpool, we also saw in 2023 that horrific pogromist attack on the hotel housing asylum seekers. I think that marked a turning point, because that was the start of these horrific attacks that we've been seeing around the country that led to a rebirth of a fascist street movement, which was encouraged by the likes of Suella Braverman, who was Home Secretary at the time, talking about an invasion of refugees and describing refugees in such a horrific, dehumanizing and language that encouraged attacks on communities. So I'm very pleased to have with us here someone representing the Merseyside Alliance for Racial Equality, but who is also a Labour councillor in Knowsley. Welcome to Chantelle Lunt.
Thank you, Sabby, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. I just want to, as everyone else has mentioned, to just send my love and solidarity to the Southport community and the families of the 3 little girls and all of the other children who were involved in the horrible attacks that happened in our region last year. Obviously, the title of today is 1 year on, and I myself am in quite a reflective space, not only in terms of where I'm thinking, but also where I am geographically, because I'm in Cornwall, where I was exactly last year when the Southport attack happened. And I always remember it quite significantly because the signal is awful here. And I remember looking at my phone as I got here, and the last text I had was from a Sky reporter saying, "Oh, can you give a comment on the attacks?" And looking up and seeing what had happened in Southport, and my thinking immediately going to, oh my goodness, do you know what I mean? How are we going to support the community? How are we going to support the family? We know that Merseyside has a history of just rallying around, and that was where my thinking was. That's what the next step was going to be, just supporting and loving everyone who'd been involved in the horrific attacks. And then a day later, when I turned my phone on, absolute disbelief, because how can we have gone from there to the city burning, to libraries burning, to the whole Muslim community being targeted and mosques being targeted in the same region? It just felt like it didn't make sense, and it felt like I wasn't going back to a city that was the one that I knew, and that was exasperated because on the day that we got back, we had the news that they were going to target charity support on asylum seekers, and I remember the police and a number of leaders telling us not to go out. It was just bricks and mortars, let the police do their job. And it wasn't just bricks and mortar, it was our community, and of course we were going to go out and defend our community. And we went out and we did what we did, and we outnumbered them, and that was the last night of the significant unrest. But for me personally, you know, I'm not just speaking as an activist but a mother. Literally the next morning, my son was targeted by someone inspired by everything that was going on, who said they were going to burn and kill him, who then smashed up our car. So when we talk about a year on, I just want to kind of remind people that we as a family have not rested since that day. I've never not felt like I could be safe in Liverpool, but I still don't feel like me or my family are safe because of what happened. We still have something called target hardening, which if anyone's ever been targeted by the far right or anyone violent will know what that means. And significantly sat here in Cornwall to get another text off anti-racist saying the far right are actually back outside a hotel in the Wirral this time, which is in Merseyside, a hotel in Woolley. Same narrative, and knowing that what happened in Knowsley in 2023 was just the test. That was just the test for the copy and paste that they would use every time they felt that there was an opportunity. And to think about, a few years back when we had, as the working class, that strike, that hot strike summer where we were trying to bring the classes together and really fight for working class issues and be like, listen, this is what we need to be pointing at. People in power, people who are the 1%, people on yachts, not those on boats, small boats. That's where we need to be focused, and just to see how these people who are trying to co-opt our movement are trying to have their own summer, but a summer that's trying to tear our communities apart, not build them together. So I think it's really important to look at how they are mobilising, because a few weeks ago I was told that in no uncertain terms, Reform have got a circle around Knowsley and they are going to be campaigning, and this is one of the key areas that they want to make significant wins in. They've got a circle around Merseyside, and we need to understand that a lot of the riots that happened last year happened in northern areas, in highly white working class areas. That is not an accident. Economic disadvantage has always gone hand in hand with far-right narratives, because they've always existed, but they always gain power when people feel like they're not being listened to or supported, and when people aren't doing well financially. And the heartbreaking part about that is we have, for the first time in a long while, we're in a position where we're in government and we could change that, and we could really be serving working class people. So we absolutely need to be doing more. Politically, we need to be doing more to serve working class people, and to be ensuring that message that will always be out there is falling upon deaf ears. Because for that message to be received in a city like Liverpool, a city literally built from migration, that was once proudly known as the world in one city, for that anti-migrant message to be heard, received and acted upon in a city like ours, that should strike fear in absolutely all of us. But when we talk about showing up where they show up and getting out on the ground and boots on the ground and protests and all of that, I think it's important to know that they're showing up in community, they're showing up in working class spaces, they're showing up in our sports spaces, they're showing up in our kids' spaces, they're showing up in our women's spaces. So it's equally as important not only to be out protesting when they turn up at hotels, but to be doing the daily grind work in communities, to be out there actively engaging with communities. And that actually means winning back a lot of people who've been taken in, to quote a Scottish MP, by the snake oil salesman who sold us Brexit, taken in by that message, taken in by the message of Farage, taken in by the message of the far right. But it doesn't mean compromising on our message, compromising on who we are or who we know the working class are. The fact that we know the working class are migrants, the fact that we don't have to tell people our value in order to see our humanity, but we know that we've got value. We knew that if you did get everyone on the boat, everyone you'd want to get on the boat today and get them out of the UK would be on its knees. We all know there'd be no NHS, there'd be no transport system, there'd be no anything, because most of our workforce is made up of migration or descendants of migrants or the Windrush generation who rebuilt this country, but also to speak to the exceptionalism in their own arguments, because we've had another attack in Liverpool. Obviously, it's not comparable, but we saw how quickly, when someone who is a white male has attacked someone, how differently the narrative is shaped, and how quickly we talk about their family and their business and their house and all of those things. We've seen in the news today, we've got a white male who's suspected of committing a violent crime, who's crossed borders to flee that violent crime. But there's no protest about that because he's a white male. We see the flaws in their arguments. We see how pointing at black and brown men and saying they're the sole risk to women and children actually puts women and children at more risk. Because those of us who know the statistics know that significantly it's more likely to be white men, and white men who are in the home. It's a men's issue. That's the biggest risk to women and children. And yet when we just point to a certain community, we put a lot of women and children at risk. So we need to point out the flaws and the blatant lies in their arguments. But above all, we need our left wing political movements to be doing what they're supposed to be doing and serving working class communities. Because when working class people's needs are met, especially through a sufficiently funded welfare state, a sufficiently funded NHS, housing, food, schools, all those things we know we need, children's centres, then that message does tend to fall on deaf ears. But I'm kind of trying to be like, oh, let's end on a high, but we're all looking at the news today and it does look like a repeat of last year. But one thing I will say is the community consistently and persistently shows up, especially when the police don't. And so for me, one of the biggest things I remember after what happened to us as a family was at the point of having someone who was literally at one point behind our house who'd attacked my son and my husband, and they'd had to go one way. And I was in my house with my youngest son, scared and on the phone to the police. It took the police 10 hours to get to my house in an emergency. It took the community about half an hour to get to my family and to give us everything that we needed. And as much as we look to these institutions, I do think we always need to be looking at a grassroots level, because community will always be where the solution lies. And as someone mentioned, not everyone agrees with what's being said, but the majority have never agreed with the narrative of hate and division. But what we need to do is get that majority activated. We need to get them mobilised, and we need to get them campaigning as strongly as we do, because as previous speakers like Weyman have said, until we get numbers out there and show them that there's more of us than them, then they won't back down. But we've seen them back down in Liverpool, and I'm sure that we can do it again. Solidarity, comrades. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chantelle, for that fantastic contribution. So I think you made some really excellent points, particularly about how no one community is uniquely responsible for violent murders, violent attacks, or rape, sexual abuse, and sexual assault. This is a society-wide problem. It's particularly a problem relating to men and sexism in society, and it's got to be rooted out everywhere, irrespective of the ethnicity and the nationality of the perpetrator, and irrespective of the ethnicity and nationality of the victims. We stand against all such horrific crimes, regardless of whoever the perpetrator is. Moving on, so this meeting is about campaigning against all forms of racism, and it's important for us to challenge anti-Semitism, because Mohammed Kozbar earlier made a very important point that when racism rises, whether it's Islamophobia or other forms of racism, it impacts all communities. And a rise in Islamophobia that is peddled by politicians, it also leads to racism and anti-Semitism towards Jewish communities. So we're very pleased to have a video from someone who has been an outstanding anti-fascist and campaigner against anti-Semitism and campaigner against all forms of racism. He's an officer of Stand Up to Racism, and he is a representative of the Jewish Socialist group and an excellent anti-fascist historian. So the next video we'll hear from David Rosenberg, who sadly couldn't be with us today, but please enjoy the video that he's provided for us.
Sorry I can't be with you live. I'm travelling back from Scotland, where Trump arrived the other day, warning that Europe is finished unless we, quotes, get our act together to stop the, quotes, invasion of migrants and refugees. He's one person we should turn away. We're 1 year on from the pogroms here, organised by fascists from different, often competing groups who mobilised a much wider mob, not just hardened racists, but also those fooled by relentless stop the boats propaganda from the political and media establishment and years of Islamophobic conditioning, telling them that every problem in their lives actually caused by the wealthy who rip them off every day are caused instead by migrants and refugees. I'm sickened by cowardly centrist politicians who continue to cede ground to far-right arguments. So glad a principled alternative is being born. Another anniversary, 120 years ago, August 1905, Britain's first peacetime anti-immigration law, the Aliens Act, drastically reducing the flow of East European Jewish migrants and refugees into Britain. My grandparents were fortunate to get in. And that's when the evil edifice of immigration control began to be constructed. Everything that is racist, heartless and repressive in the treatment of downtrodden peoples today, exercising their freedom of movement, stems from the principles and machinery of that 1905 Act, passed by Tories, opposed by Liberals. The Tories lost an election soon after, but the Act was implemented by those same Liberals, a dance repeated by Tories and Labour, especially from the 1960s to the 1980s. Each party tried to outdo the other in repressive laws against Caribbean and Asian migrants who were exercising citizenship in the country that had colonised, robbed and enslaved their forebears. The brutal language which divided humans into, quotes, desirable and, quotes, undesirable was set in 1905, and the judges of that were the wealthy and powerful. That act created immigration officers, including those who could turn people away on medical grounds, powers of later deportation of individuals who entered legally. Its ideological effects plague migrants today, as certain politicians and press label those deemed undesirable in a particular period as a problem, a burden, inferior, liars and cheats with alien backward cultures. The edifice created later nightmares, from refugees fleeing Nazism in the late 1930s, including those who arrived on small boats being turned away, to the monstrous injustices inflicted on the Windrush generation. Once treated as desirable, decades later, many black people were forced into poverty, then deported to destitution and early death in the Caribbean. Compensation payments for errors have been pitiful. But I'm inspired by the courage and determination of anti-racists and anti-fascists challenging those targeting hotels housing asylum seekers. I'm inspired too by the quiet and dedicated efforts of those in coastal communities to welcome and support refugees and to patiently persuade local people to do the same. But let's keep our arguments crystal clear on principles. I cringe when I hear more liberal people saying, we need immigrants because of the worsening care crisis in this country. What we need is a fully funded care service in this country with proper remuneration for all its workers, not one that only values migrants as low-paid workers in difficult conditions. Every migrant and every refugee needs to be treated with dignity, valued for their humanity and everything that they bring to the society and their community, not just their role as economic units. We are no island of strangers. We are and must be one world of equals, united by our shared humanity. No one is illegal.
Fantastic video there from David Rosenberg. He never lets us down. So moving on, our next speaker is someone who needs very little introduction, but I think it's important to give her a very good introduction. I think you will struggle to find anyone else in Britain who has got a more outstanding record on fighting all forms of racism, whether it's attacks on refugees or attacks on economic migrants, attacks on African Caribbean communities, Asian communities, Muslims, Jews, all communities that face racism. She is Britain's first Black woman MP. She is president of Stand Up to Racism. Her anti-racist record is second to none. I'm very pleased to welcome, as I'm sure you're all very pleased to have with us this evening, Diane Abbott MP for Hackney North and Stoke Newington.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Well, first of all, I'd like to congratulate Stand Up to Racism for organising this very important meeting, because my concern is that when it comes to issues of race and migration, we could be going into quite dark times, both here and in Western Europe and North America. But as the child of immigrants, not only do I want to stand shoulder to shoulder with immigrants in struggle, I also want to stress the humanity of migrants. We have a very unfortunate political dialogue at the moment, where the three major political parties are insisting, some loudly, some a little bit more quietly, that if we have problems with the public service, if people have problems with housing, if people have problems, they should blame migrants and asylum seekers. Even, I'm sorry to say, the leader of my party actually takes pride in how tough he's been on immigration, takes pride on the number of people he's been able to deport since we came to power. So it makes it really important that we have a different narrative. It makes it really important that we contest with the fascists where they emerge, because wherever you've had migrants, you have had fascists on the streets. It was true when my parents came here in the 1950s. You had the teddy boys, you had the black shirts. Where you have migrants, you have fascists on the street, and it is very important, as people have said earlier, that these fascists are outnumbered so we can show that they do not dominate the narrative. We need to be on the street. We need to be in our trade union movements. We need to be in our committees and in our Labour Party events. And we need to be saying that we will, the party, any party, will not win by pandering to anti-immigration sentiment. In fact, when you have a major party like the Labour Party echoing the narrative of reform, that just justifies them, and that just makes things worse. So in every generation, we have to fight for migrants. In every generation, we have to contest with those elements in the movement that think that there's some way out of standing shoulder to shoulder with migrants. I know, we all know, that migrants are very glad not to feel isolated. They're very glad that we come out for them. And it's not just that we're coming out to support the migrants, it means we're a better Labour movement. It's not just an act of charity. It's about our values, what we stand for, what we're prepared to fight for. So we're going to be on the street in the coming days. I hope to see some of you in Islington, which will be my nearest demonstration. So we cannot allow the fascists to win. We cannot allow Donald Trump to win. We cannot allow Nigel Farage to win. We are going to show them, whether it's verbally, whether it's actually physically contesting with them, we are going to show them that they're not going to win, they can't win, and the British people are better than that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Diane, for that fantastic contribution. I think you made several important points there. Firstly, about the demonstration in Islington this Saturday. So please join all of us outside the Thistle Hotel, which is near the St Luke's estate, near Old Street. It's called the Thistle Barbican, but it's near Old Street, also near Angel, whatever's convenient for you. So please join us in Islington on Saturday. The precise details will be available later because we have to negotiate and agree all of that with the police. It's difficult always when we are organising counter demonstrations. But thank you for reminding us of the demonstration in Islington on Saturday, Diane. Diane also made important points about how not only is it morally wrong for Labour to be making speeches like the Island of Strangers speech and making various announcements and commitments about reducing migration and stopping the boats, is feeding a narrative that is allowing the far right to grow in Britain. But it's also electorally a big mistake for Labour, because Labour is losing votes, not winning votes, by pursuing this strategy. And also, in the same vein, it was somewhat hypocritical, I think, for Labour to suspend Diane Abbott when she's a leading anti-racist, and when Labour is pursuing many racist policies and making so many concessions to Nigel Farage and Reform UK. So I hope Labour sees sense, and I hope that Diane Abbott will be rejoining the Labour benches soon. So solidarity with Diane for everything that you've been through and all the horrific racism that you've been subjected to, and good luck with everything going forward. And I think that's a nice little segue to the introduction for our final speaker for this evening, who is someone who I've been very proud to work with and stand with on many demonstrations that have been campaigning against racism and also defending refugee rights. And there was one in particular that springs to mind, and that is on the 15th of September, almost exactly 10 years ago, in 2015, I was very proud to stand with the leader of the Labour Party at that very important Refugees Welcome demonstration. It was so fantastic to have a Labour leader who was leading a demonstration of 100,000 strong, saying refugees welcome, stop the drownings of refugees in the English Channel, and let's have a humane and humanitarian approach to refugee rights and fighting racism and fascism. So I am very pleased to welcome the MP for Islington North, Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you very much, Sabby, and thank you very much for all those that have spoken. Absolutely brilliant this evening. The message, I think, is a very powerful one from everybody, and I'm really moved by what Chantelle Lunt said about the way the community defended her family when they were going through the most horrific racist attacks against them. And she said, community you can rely on, the forces of the state, not necessarily. So I think there's a message there that it is about taking all our campaigns out into the community all the time. And all the speeches we've had this evening have been broadly similar in the sense of the message we're putting forward. Let's look at it very briefly in this wider context. All across Europe, there's been a rise of far-right parties in Spain, in Italy, in Austria, in Germany, in the Netherlands, Scandinavia, France, and so on. You know it, you name it. In every case where the far right have arisen, the fascist far right, the conservative parties have moved to the right. Moved to the right in order to try and protect their support from going to the far right. And so in some cases, they've ended up virtually in coalitions with the far right, but nevertheless, they have made that move. That has meant that for the most part, the socialist parties or social democratic parties or Labour parties have also moved to the right and adopted some of the similar rhetoric that has been adopted. Think Keir Starmer's reference to Enoch Powell in 1968 in his recent speech about strangers. And that has meant that the message has been basically that the economic problems of our society, all societies, are caused by the levels of migration. It is complete and utter nonsense, that we all know. And so it is important that the new political gap is not filled by a debate with these people about how much migration there should be, what the problems refugees have, or it should be filled instead by a very strong message of anti-racism, but also a message about economic justice, anti-poverty strategies, and equality. Because the far right feed on the idea that somehow or other the shortage of teachers, the waiting list at hospitals, the shortage of housing, you name it, whatever it happens to be, it's somehow or other the fault of refugees and migrants into our society. Nigel Farage says it every single day in some context or the other. So it is about uniting people in a message that we can do things differently. We can unite together as working class communities to defeat the far right and at the same time campaign for better housing, better education and a better health service, and campaign against the vile war that's going on in the bombardment of the people of Gaza by British supplied weapons that have gone to Israel. And we don't have to be spending 13 billion a year more on armaments when we should be spending that money on a combination of overseas aid, ending child poverty, and not attacking disability benefits. There are so many issues that we have to campaign on. So it is about the unity that goes with it. I remember back to 1968 when Powell made that speech, disgusting, disgraceful, presented as though somehow or other the solution to all the problems of then levels of unemployment, inequality, that case in Birmingham in 1968, were all created by the people who themselves had created the National Health Service, were running the transport industry, and actually working in a lot of the very hard, heavy industry in Birmingham. The foundries, the engineering works, and all those other places. Many people work there from Jamaica, from Nigeria, from India, from Pakistan, and so on. They're the ones that created the economic system and benefits that the rest of us have all benefited from. And so when we oppose the far right now, we have to think back to those that have stood up in the past to oppose the rise of the far right. It's not an exaggeration to say the rise of the Nazis in Britain in the 1920s and particularly the 1930s, when there were the marches led by Oswald Mosley in the East End and other places, was stopped by working class communities, a combination of the Irish community, the Jewish community, the black community in London. They turned out in Cable Street and other places. They turned out to show that they were not prepared to allow these fascists to divide us. That lesson applies just as much today as it did then. We cannot allow ourselves to be divided. So when these people assemble outside hotels that are housing refugees, ask yourself this question. All they want to do is harass and damage those people that are in those hotels. Do those people want to be in those hotels? No. They want to work. They want to contribute. They want to be part of our society and our community. But they're kept in poverty and forced to live in these hotels for months, if not years at a time. It is simply a crazy, horrible system that's designed to create problems. And the idea, as Donald Trump seems to think, that anybody coming on a boat from France is somehow or other an enemy. Diane and others, and me, and been to Calais and talked to those people that are in a desperate situation. Nobody would willingly risk themselves and their children's lives getting into those rubber boats to try and cross the channel, even on a calm summer's day. You wouldn't risk it unless you were utterly desperate. So to say it's all the fault of the people smugglers is not entirely true. The people smugglers have had a market created for them by this particular system. We need safe routes for people to seek safety and asylum, and recognize the wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya have all created massive refugee flows of people that are desperate to try to get to a place of safety. Let's support them and not allow the victims to be demonized in the way that they are. This Saturday in Islington, there will be a demonstration. There'll be a demonstration to support those people that are in that hotel, just as there was in Epping last week, just as there was a year ago when we stood up against the far right outside all our mosques and synagogues and so on all over the country. And so let that be the message and the example, that we can stand together. We can give people hope. And from that hope comes the unity of communities to deal with all the other economic and social issues that we face in our society. Thank you, Stand Up to Racism. Thank you, all those trade union leaders that have been on the call tonight. Thank you, obviously, to my colleagues such as Diane, who's spoken so brilliantly tonight. Together, we can defeat the far right. We can defeat the fascists and offer hope of something different. A policy that redistributes wealth and power in our society, that deals with the social problems people face, and give young people real hope in their unity. Thank you very much, Sabby.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, for taking the time out to join us this evening. Fantastic speech, as always, and good luck with everything going forward. Important announcements. Jeremy and Diane Abbott have reminded us all about the demonstration outside the Thistle City Barbican. We'll be as close to the hotel as we can possibly get. It's Saturday, the 2nd of August, 12 p.m, nearest tube, Old Street or Angel. And please keep an eye out for any updates on the Stand Up to Racism website and our social media. Secondly, 13th of September, all out in central London to oppose Tommy Robinson and his fascist and racist Islamophobic thugs. We've got to stand up to these horrific fascist street mobilisations. We've got to bring that same spirit that we brought onto the streets last summer in 2024 when we halted the riots. We've got to bring that same spirit against all these demonstrations that are happening outside hotels and elsewhere up and down the country, and on the 13th of September. So please keep an eye out for all those local demonstrations, and all out for 13th of September. And join Stand Up to Racism. We are a membership organisation. We are only as strong as our activists and our members. And please get involved and join us. We're very proud to have a fantastic, strong membership and activist base. Get involved in your local group. So thank you very much to all of our speakers who have taken time out to prepare excellent speeches and contributions to this very important online rally. 1 year on from the riots, we are not an island of strangers. We are people that stand for human rights, that stand against all forms of racism, and we pledge to bring that anti-racist spirit back onto the streets again. And thank you to all our volunteers who have been helping behind the scenes. We couldn't have done this without you. You've all been brilliant, done a fantastic job. And thank you to all of you who registered and joined this meeting, and apologies to anyone for any technical difficulties and trouble getting the links. These things are always very difficult. Sometimes technology can be a bit overrated. There can be some inexplicable problems. So thank you, all of you, for joining us here today. And as we go forward, let's stand up to racism and fascism. Solidarity.